anxiety into shame and guilt.
Yeah, so, we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, or God knows when we talked about it, but that a lot of our anxiety comes from our desire to control, right?
Yeah.
So we talked about that a bit, and obviously that's kind of like outward looking, that it's an outward, or the anxiety is a manifestation of what we're looking at outside of ourselves and wanting to control. But that's also related to what's, of course, going on inside of ourselves too, and that we're wanting to control. That whether it's that desire to be perfect, or to, take care of all of those things in our lives.
Yeah.
And so some of that goes to kind of that difference between guilt and shame, right? Like we tend to use them interchangeably.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, oh, I'm ashamed of what I did, right? Like so we use it that way. But if I were to pare it down to its simplest form, and then we can expound on that. But I would say that the difference between guilt and shame is the difference between saying I did something bad and I am bad, right? So guilt is the I did something bad, and shame is I am bad. Yeah. And so that's tough to balance, obviously. And people can have different ways of entering into that. I like to joke that, I was raised Roman Catholic, so I have a really good concept of guilt. You know what I mean? But at the same time, that can be unhealthy if it leads towards that shame, right? One of the basic presuppositions of Christianity, right, is that we're sinners, right? That Paul talks about this. Christ came to save sinners, of whom I am first. And it makes sense that we have to talk about it that way, right? Because if you were perfect, you wouldn't need a savior. Yeah. You have to need to be saved from something. Yeah. And for us, it's to be saved from the consequences of our own sin, which is, of course, is death. Okay. That real eternal death in hell, as opposed to physical temporal death. So we have to train ourselves to be able to think about these things in a healthy way. I want to say it was St. Silouan the Athonite who said that there are two thoughts which you should fear. That one is that I'm a great saint and I will surely be saved. The other one is I'm a great sinner and I will surely go to hell. That the truth is that, you're a sinner, but God desires your salvation anyways. Like, that's what he does. That's the whole reason Christ came, is to save us from ourselves. Yeah. So, again, that anxiety we can experience in terms of that wanting to control and all of that it's also directly related to our inability to be honest with ourselves. We talked about giving up that illusion of control. That's one of those things. It requires us to be honest with ourselves, and that's hard to take a critical look at yourself, engage in that reflection, and be able to, number one, admit it, and then number two, work at being okay with it, and so we have that same issue, I think, in relation to sin. Many times we like to think about these other things because they can distract us from having to think of our own sin. But we have to be able to think of our sin in a healthy way. Not that it's a healthy thing to be a sinner, but just that it's the reality of the situation is that we are all sinners, and we have to come to terms with that in a healthy way, without going to the I am bad instead of the I did a bad thing. Yeah.
And I guess because it really is easy to blur that line that, you know, I made a mistake and I am a mistake.
Yeah. You know, and especially because we can get into these, you know, this downward spiral of thinking, where we're trapped in our own thoughts, and you're like, oh, I do this all the time. Oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me, and it's like, well, there is something wrong with you. You're human, you know. It's but that's just the reality of the situation. But there's a lot of ways we can go wrong in that too, even thinking about our own status of being a sinner, right? I brought a really good book with me today. It's called How to Be a Sinner by Dr. Peter Buteneff, who is a professor at St. Vladimir's Seminary. And we did a book study on this at church last Lent in 2019. And I think it was really valuable for the people who participated, because there's a lot of ways that we can approach being a sinner that aren't healthy ways. Just to give you a little bit from this introduction, you know, he says, he's like, self-identifying as a sinner is tricky to get right. I can have healthy reasons for avoiding that identity, as it has been known to perpetuate harmful behavior or abusive relationships. Focusing on myself as a sinner risks becoming maudlin or masochistic. Yet the sinner identity is useful if only to provoke us to ask ourselves some challenging questions. Am I reluctant to take a deep critical look at my thoughts and actions? Am I afraid of humility because it might set me back in my career ambitions? Am I just a pawn in a dominant culture of self-gratification? These questions are neither simple nor straightforward, but grappling with them can play a pivotal role in my flourishing, my inner peace, my relationship with God and the world. And he gives a few examples of like the wrong way to do it, which is they're humorous, but they're common, I think. You know, he says, well, John considers himself a basically decent person. He has never seriously injured anyone. He's faithful to his wife. He goes to work, does his job, and looks after his family. He's more or less honest in his financial dealings. He doesn't see the point of confessing his sins. Sure, he tells the odd lie and sometimes stares at erotic images on the internet, but he believes in God and regards himself as a normal, reasonable person. He sometimes quotes Homer Simpson saying, I'm not a bad guy. I work hard and love my kids, so why should I spend half my Sunday hearing about how I'm going to hell? Then the second one, Joanne despises herself and her life. Her parents hadn't wanted children and regularly reminded her that if anything, they would have preferred a son. They rarely called her by her name. Her father sometimes beat her, though in other moods he was uncomfortably affectionate. Nothing that Joanne did seemed to be good enough. Her efforts always fell short of what her parents wanted. In fact, she couldn't figure out what their expectations were, given that they fluctuated between the unattainably high and the pathetically low. She sometimes cuts herself. The idea of calling herself a sinner makes her feel sick. Although she knows the term well, it represents everything she's trying to move beyond. Her therapist has advised her to have as little to do with her family and her church as possible. Then the third one, Paisios joined the church a year and a half ago. His name used to be Jim, but he's asked his friends and family to refer to him by his new Christian name. He signs his emails, even if they contain nothing more than the day's shopping list, the wretch Paisios. He is participating in an unacknowledged contest with others as to who is the worst sinner. He dresses in black, reads ascetical literature, and has grown a flourishing beard. He goes to confession, though not to his parish priest, but to a monk 250 miles away. So you can see, obviously, that there's a lot of ways to not understand that status of being a sinner in a healthy way. And then, of course, the entirety of the book is about how do you come to that and have a healthy relationship with who you are as a sinner who stands in need of salvation. And that's complicated, of course, but I think that as we've been talking about, that first step is distinguishing between guilt and shame, and trying to work through that so that we can understand that it's not a contest, right? Like, again, like as you and I have talked about on multiple occasions, that the beginning of our problem is always when we compare ourselves to other people, whether it's to feel better about ourselves or to feel worse about ourselves. You're like, man, this guy's got it all together. Everything's great. Why isn't my life like that? Or you look at somebody and you're like, oh, this guy's terrible. Thank God my life's not like that. And it's like, well, the only person we're supposed to look to is Christ, as St. Porphyrios says. And, look to Christ, and that will save you.
That will save you.
So, yeah.
How is it that we begin to look at our shame? How does somebody begin that process? Or is it always, I know things are always happening to us, but so many things can happen to us that, we could go on for the rest of our lives and not really.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And especially in the society we live in, we're given plenty of opportunities to not look inward and think about our lives. But like everything else, I think that begins with the process of self-reflection, of making that time in order to be thinking about these things. And obviously it's hard, and not everybody can do it on their own. Some people do need to go and talk to a therapist, or, there's plenty of other things, right? We can have chemical imbalances in our brains that make it difficult for us to be able to encounter this in a healthy way, right? So I would in no way discount or discredit modern psychotherapy or psychoanalysis as a valuable tool, if for no other reason than it creates the space in which that process can happen, because that's really what it's all about, right? Is looking at what's going on in my life, how, all of that. And if we're not doing that, then we're bound to end up in trouble on one side or the other, because we're not reflecting on what we're doing, whether it's because of this self-denial of, I'm not like that, or whatever the case may be. So, But again, if we're not doing that self-reflection, then none of this is possible, really.
I guess it is disheartening, the culture that we have, right? Is we're so ashamed to admit we have problems. Like, I've known my whole life I've had problems, and we all do it, but yet we're supposed to feel bad about these things. The difference in approaches in the Eastern tradition versus the Western tradition, into like how we look at shame.
In the East, the most common metaphor for sin and being in a state of sinfulness is not being guilty as it normally is in the West, right? In the East, it's the concept of being sick.
Yeah.
Right? That sin is a disease. It's a sickness that we have fallen prey to. Yeah. And so when we stand before Christ, that we are not there for him to pronounce a judgment on us, or to pretend like it didn't happen. Yeah. But rather he's a doctor. We always not always, but we frequently refer to Christ as the physician of our souls and bodies. And so it's more akin to going to the doctor and telling him what the symptoms are of your sickness and his healing you. Just the same way we would if we went to a doctor's office because we weren't feeling well. They'd say, oh, I feel this, I feel that. And you'd be like, all right, let me run some tests, or let me take a look. And then, we can provide a medicine to make you better. Prescription. So that, I think, is by and large the biggest difference. Now, of course, we still believe that there is a judgment day and all of that. But it doesn't have to do, it's not a legal transaction, right? Yeah. If it were a legal transaction, well, we'd be hosed. It wouldn't, And you run into all sorts of problems, I think, with a legalistic mindset.
Yep.
If you come in, because, and we've talked about this before, right? Like being beyond words, because if Christ is just, well, then it's not justice in the way we think of it.
Yeah.
Because we're clearly guilty, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if we're going to use that metaphor, we are clearly guilty.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be a travesty of justice for him to be like, who cares?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's been the liberating thing I've found in the church, is that, you know, he didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it. It's
absolutely. Well, and this is exactly what Christ himself talks about. He says that, you know, the healthy don't need a doctor, right?
Yeah.
The sick do.
Yeah.
Like, this is what he's talking about. This is the metaphor that Christ chooses for himself.
Yeah. So for the hesitant soul out there who may be thinking, you know, I need help, he can begin the work if we acknowledge it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're living in a state of denial, right? Like, it's the same as if you're sick and you're like, I don't need to go to the doctor. I'm fine. I'm not really that, you know, it's the same thing, right? Like, you have to, you know, or like in 12-step, right? Like, number one, you have to admit you have a problem, right? Like, until you admit you have a problem, you can't do anything about it. Because you're refusing to face the reality of the situation.
That reality is something.
But it's also freeing.
Yeah.
You know, because, again, talking about this illusion of control, right? So we have the opportunity to liberate ourselves from those chains that we have placed on ourselves.
Here recently, I've just discovered, or not discovering, but I'm seeing the faces that shame and guilt can have. Just this legalistic way of viewing things. It's not about this who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad. I don't know. That is liberating, and not to give way to just, you know, I have this, I can just go sin and I'm good, but I can look at this differently. That is, I don't know, it really is freeing.
No, absolutely.
It really is.
And I think that's, even that different mindset is helpful for us to acknowledge the reality of our situation, because if it's a concern about punishment, right, then that's like when you get into these weird feelings and this denial of it, and you're like, well, I'm not doing that. I don't, you know. I've read some stuff that it says basically that we teach our children to lie because even if we know they did something, we are like, did you do that? And they're afraid of the consequence. And so, like, you could have literally just watched them do it and they go, no. Yeah. You know, and then so this is where it comes from, because it's that feeling, that, you know, that fear, that terror that they have inside them that makes them want to deny it instead of have that opportunity to accept it, learn from it, and move on. And so if we're stuck in that mentality, then absolutely, it's almost impossible to come to terms with it. You know, at least in a healthy way, right? Because then that's that point at which you start leaning towards, I'm a terrible person, right? You know, but nobody thinks they're a terrible person when they have a cold, right? Like, you know?
And that's
like,
really how we should look at it.
Yeah.
Okay.
But you would want to get better. You would want to seek healing, and that's what we're trying to do. So
and it really is just a battle to not just sit there and beat yourself up for being human. Just not getting stuck where you are, and that it's. I mean, shoot, it's okay, right?
No, absolutely, and the thing that comes along with this that I think helps us is that liberation of, if we are able to look at ourselves that way, then it also helps us when we're looking at other people to avoid that judgment that we're obviously so prone to go for immediately, because we can then understand that other people are sick too. Yeah. And like, you wouldn't get angry at somebody for having the flu, you know, like you'd be like, oh, you're terrible, I hate you, you got the flu. And it's like, you know, so when we can adjust our mindset that way, then it's easier for us to understand that some of the things that other people do are just manifestations of how they're sick, right? And so we wouldn't be like, oh man, yeah, I can't believe that, you know, why do you have a fever? You know, why are you throwing up? You know, it's like, you understand. It's like, okay, well, that goes along with having the flu. So it's, you know, you'd feel bad for them.
Yeah. It should produce compassion.
Yeah.
Okay. Man, it really is all too easy to man, I don't.
Just do it.
Just do it.
You know, and again, I think this is just so related to this desire for control, because in order to look at yourself that way, you have to make yourself vulnerable. And nobody wants to look weak, right? Yeah. Like, that's the, you know, oh, I'm weak if I'm this way, or other people might take advantage of me. And but again, if you don't care, then it's liberating. You know.
Okay. I like the image that whenever, because you told me recently that we react out of pride. That's the first thing that hits, and so
absolutely.
We put the ego. But the image that I try to keep in mind is, the ego is so infantile that, you know, it's like putting this baby up for defense instead of just kind of accepting. We put this infant in front to take all these blows. And
as we were talking about, like, what real control is, you know, if somebody else does something and you lose your mind over it, you're not in control. You're reacting instead of acting. And so that other person, now you've given them control over you, because you've basically said, I am going to do a certain thing depending on what this person does. And so your entire perspective and demeanor is now being controlled by the actions of other people.
So what is that we, because it's almost like we want to be controlled.
Learned a lot of wrong things about what control is, right? Because, I mean, the ultimate control is self-control. And if you don't have self-control, you know, over your emotions, your reactions, all of that, then you're simply a slave. Yeah. You are enslaved to everybody else and whatever they may think or whatever they may do. If you feel as though you need to react to it in a certain way.
Is it worse here, or is it just human thing?
I don't know. I mean, I think everybody deals with it, right? I mean, because part of what you're saying about, like, being an infant is accurate, right? Because babies can control other people's actions by their emotional responses to a certain extent, right? They can get their diaper changed. They can get fed. You know, if they, you know. Okay. Theoretically, we're supposed to grow out of that.
Well, I guess the fear, right, is that because we don't have it all, right? We don't have total control over who we are, that it gets discouraging in the process of developing this sense of self-control. So it's like we start the process and then boom, all right, well, I just can't, I give up. And so I'll just keep falling into these same patterns again and again and again.
Yeah, sure. I mean, they're defense mechanisms,
Yeah.
right? People do things because they worked. At one point or another, they got the response
Yeah.
that they wanted, you know? Whether it was the fulfillment of a physical need or an emotional need or whatever it is, you know, that all of it is born out of, I do this, I get this response.
Yeah.
That's the response I want, so I'm going to do it. And again, for infants, for babies, that's natural, right?
Yeah.
They have no other way to tell you that they're hungry, right?
Yeah.
But this is something that we're supposed to figure out as we grow up.
Yeah.
Most of us don't. Most of us are still trying to deal with the reality of that and what it should mean for us in terms of healthily getting what we need from others, whether it's that emotional contact or whatever it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we're called to be childlike,
Childlike,
not childish,
not child.
right? Yeah. There's a big difference between the two.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah,
Because I think that that being childlike is the innocence, the purity, the astonishment at almost everything, right? Like just that, like everything is just amazing.
Yep.
Right? Like, you know?
Yeah. Man.
But again, I think so. If we're going to go back to what we started with, this anxiety, the guilt versus shame, the perhaps guilty versus sick, like all of these are very, very helpful categories for us to try to consider the whole of our lives and how we are going to act. But again, all of this requires reflection. It requires stillness. It requires removing ourselves from our normal routines in order to actually make the time to do that.
Yep.
Because otherwise we're just flitting from one thing to another. You know, we talked about this before, that might have been St. Dorotheus of Gaza, who I quoted a few weeks ago, who says that, you know, there can be no spiritual life without stillness, right? Like distraction is the death of the spiritual life. And so we have to keep that in mind, that if we want to be constantly entertained, well, we're going to have problems.
Yeah.
We're going to have problems because we're not allowing ourselves that room that we need in order to grow into the people that God wants us to be.
Yeah. Okay.
I will say again that this book, How to Be a Sinner by Dr. Peter Butanev, that's available from St. Vladimir's Seminary Press or other online book retailers, is a great resource for this. It's a really easy read. It's written very clearly. You know, the whole thing's only about 200 pages, just a little over 200 pages with the appendices, and it's I've found this to be very, very valuable.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think the people who were in the book study did as well.
Yeah.
So
I don't know what episode this would be. We'll figure it out.
If you have further questions, please leave them in the comments so we can address these things as they come up. Because I think this is probably a big thing that a lot of people deal with. And it would be great to have some feedback. And maybe next week we can dig into some of your comments and questions and go from there.
Do send questions. If you follow me on Instagram, send me a DM, jump in the comments, like, subscribe, do all those things. And until next time,